we as a movement need to put forth an appealing, positive vision. I would say who really moved the narrative in this direction is Donald Trump with MAGA. Make America Great Again is a positive vision of what to aspire to. It's not merely, let's say, William F. Buckley standing athwart history saying, stop. It's just deeply American. Like America, the American spirit loves aspiration. It loves chasing Texan. The Texan spirit loves chasing towards something big. Right. And ultimately, if we come up with a compelling vision, a compelling case for why our future is the future people should aspire to, that is going to resonate in America like nothing else.
Ready to roll?
Yep.
All right.
Real Texan.
Why should this matter to real Texans? William Travis, Jim Bowie, David Crockett, they weren't from Texas, but they came and made a mark in Texas. It's easy as a native Texan to be dismissive of those who come here, but many of those who do are the reason we have the Texas we have today, which is why it's great to sit down with Nate Fischer, guy from upstate New York who you made your mark in business in Florida and a little bit in Texas and also out in California. Why did you come to Texas?
So the short answer is I wanted to go along Texas. Mm-hmm. I had a third kid coming. I moved to Dallas. Dallas felt like a great place to raise a family, felt like a great place to build a business, felt like a great place to go along generally. And I would say, in many ways, I believe that DFW is the natural capital of Red America, or at least the natural capital. It should be the natural capital of right-aligned finance.
So I want to back up very quickly. In growing up in New York, you were homeschooled. That's, while in Texas, we tend to, homeschooling has kind of developed a comfortable cultural niche, but New York State, and certainly not when you were growing up, that wasn't the thing to do, was it?
It was not. It was the early 90s when we started, when my mother started. It was very unusual. It was still new even in Texas at that point, I think. And mm-hmm. She was a pioneer in many ways. She was an entrepreneur. I think that I credit that willingness to step outside of the box as a significant contribution toward just an independent view of the world that is so central to what I'm doing today.
Yeah, and in fact, so you came out of college, went to graduate school, law, traditional business, maybe politics. Instead, you went into real estate investing. What kind of moved you into that area, particularly in Florida?
So what was interesting was I don't even consider myself a real estate investor per se. I'm actually getting back into it in some interesting ways. But for me, it was always about what is the outside the box? What is the non-consensus, really at the macro level, theme that is creating an opportunity for outsized returns. So I graduated from law school in 2010, had an opportunity to go to a big New York law firm. But given the economy, they also offered opportunities to defer for a year. I deferred for a year, and in that year, partnered with a classmate, and we saw this tremendous dislocation in the real estate space based on in the wake of the financial crisis. It was hit hardest in Florida, which meant that was the biggest opportunity. Our thesis was people have been moving for decades to these Sunbelt red states.
Right. And
that's not going to change. There's just durable, sustainable dynamics that will continue to drive that growth. Meanwhile, you could buy apartments for literally, in some cases, apartment buildings for $10,000 a unit. And in many cases, probably $20,000, $25,000 a unit. But we're talking a quarter of replacement costs. And our thought was very simple. It was, if we're able to buy properties here, if we can hang on to them, these trends will continue. That will guarantee the market comes back. Vacancy will decline. And if we just hang on long enough, we will see something that will see very strong returns. So it was a very simple macro thesis, actually tied into some of these red state dynamics that I'm focused on now. But it was really at the macro level. There's going to be outsized opportunity here. And I saw that as attractive.
So you moved to Texas, almost a decade ago now. Did you move to Texas because you thought this was a great business environment, or because you thought this was a better place to raise your kids, or are those things kind of the same thing?
All of the above in this case. It was, it's just a center. It's a big city. I am from New York. There's something appealing about sort of large scale capital cities. Florida was great, wonderful place to raise a family, but ultimately Tampa's a much sleepier culture, especially then.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas, I sensed immediately that Dallas just had something that was, it was similar to what you see in some of these leading capital cities. It was the opportunity to go big. And I think part of it is actually there's just a culture in Texas where people like to go big. And if you're approaching things from this entrepreneurial perspective with an aim of major impact, Texas is it's a great cultural place to do that. It's also just a great place in lots of objective ways. Great business climate, airport with more nonstops to anywhere else in the country, just all these things going for it.
So you were, kind of put it delicately, you were very successful at a pretty young age where a number of folks could have just coasted along and just kind of enjoyed, sipping umbrella drinks on beaches. You've instead, though, continued kind of this entrepreneurial focus now with what you call new founding. Tell me what led you into this kind of a different kind of space.
Honestly, I was really, it was almost like I couldn't not do it. I saw the opportunity, the same thing that led me to do the real estate in the first place versus what honestly could have been a fairly comfortable legal career. It was an opportunity, and it was an opportunity that I became convinced was the largest opportunity of our time. Effectively, what new founding is at the intersection of venture and these major political paradigm shifts that are sweeping the country and really sweeping the world, sweeping society. And so we're really bringing together sort of private sector opportunity, which is just a way to do things outside of conventional institutional structures, a good domain for disruptive ideas. Technology, which is particularly good for that, but also is just, I believe that is the domain that is reshaping the world. I think it's very obvious. Look, when Trump came to office in the first place, a large share of that was online energy. It's very clear that in this past election cycle, the digital domain mattered more than ever. And you look at Musk and his acquisition of Twitter, I say that was much more akin to a feudal, rather than looking at through a PE lens, a classic business lens, it was much more akin to a feudal lord capturing a strategic domain that's relevant to an ongoing geopolitical conflict. And you look at that and realize this digital domain is the domain that matters. It's a domain that people were largely absent from on our side. And then finally, it's intersecting with these political forces that are reshaping the country. So I see that, and I see that the right, Christians, conservatives, almost entirely absent from that world. So for me, I saw that as both a need. There's a pressing need to be involved there. If we are going to be part of the group that is shaping the future, that's shaping the government of the digital age, that's shaping the domain, the digital layer of life that's going to increasingly exert influence on the others, we need to be present there. We want to have a say in that. And more than that, I also saw it as an exceptional business opportunity. It's like there's half the country that wants something other than what they're being offered today. And if we go in there and if we are present, if we use, I think, venture as a really incredible vehicle to put forward a positive vision. People are so hungry for positive vision right now. The right needs to be more than just a reactive. No, it needs to actually offer something that's a compelling alternative to where we can go, especially in a world where technology is going to disrupt a lot of things. Then that's going to resonate with people. That's going to attract people. And that's going to really be a locus of some of the most incredible business opportunities as well. So I saw it as an incredible opportunity from a business standpoint, from an investment standpoint. But I also saw it as just an imperative to build the country that we want to live in.
It feels like the kind of the easy way, and probably the wrong way, to talk about new founding as well. It's this is a values-based investing, right? And we kind of pair that. Compare that to where the left has been so willing to go in with ESG and DEI and all the other leftist think. But the one is values the right way to talk about what new founding is doing?
So I think that what's instructive is actually looking at something like ESG as an example. And a lot of people sort of assume that it's simply layering values on top of business. So there's actually a common argument that we should return to the sort of Friedman view where we just purely focus on business profits. There was a very interesting article by a guy named Julius Krein, who was a friend of mine, actually an investor in new founding. And it was a sort of examination of how ESG was actually pushed.
Mhm.
And ESG was not pushed as let's layer values on top of business. ESG was pushed as a set of theses about how the world is moving, climate change, all this stuff that are intangibles that were not being considered in corporate risk. And so they basically argued, if you actually want to understand how to account for these risks, not as values, but as realities of the world, then you need to consider these things. And they started advancing that narrative, and then they started building that into more and more significant sort of programs and policies and quotas and everything else. And those could include social changes happening, demographic changes happening, climate changes happening, all of that stuff. So they advanced it not as a values lens, but as a description of reality. I would say conservatives make a mistake when they sort of resort to thinking of this as purely values, because they're competing in the argument about what is reality. And if we just say, well, we don't like that because of our values, that's not a very persuasive win. Really, what we need to do is
it's really two different conversations.
Two different conversations, and it's kind of like ultimately reality is going to trump values.
Mhm.
What we need to do instead is realize we actually have a fundamentally different view of the world. I believe their thesis about reality is wrong. And I think that it's been proven wrong over and over and over again. You look at the history of leftism, and leftism has made claims about human nature, claims about society, claims about the arc of history. And they have a consistent record, and their record is wrong. The record is they do not understand human nature. They do not understand. They come up with these climate change is just one of many of a series of sort of secular apocalyptic theories about the world, and they fundamentally reject reality. So if we understand reality correctly, then we should be advancing our vision of the future and our vision of the world, not as a set of values that we're trying to persuade people to adopt as sort of a double bottom line on top of their corporate profits, but rather as a more persuasive account of how the world works. And if we have a more persuasive account of how the world works, in many cases, there should be profound implications to that. So I like to say this is sort of the best lens is actually more akin to that famous Thiel line, where Thiel says, what is one important thing that you believe that very few people agree with you on? And if you have a thesis that very few people agree with you on, or in many cases, maybe the markets don't agree with you, even if a lot of people do, then you should be able to make a concentrated bet on that. And if you're right and they're wrong, there's going to be a successful outcome there. You're not arguing. There might be values associated with that. It might be why you don't like the values associated with sort of their view of the world. But you hold your conservative views not simply because you like conservatism better, but because you believe it describes the world better, because you believe it describes human nature better. So I think that lens, first of all, that lens is just much more interesting. If you go into a room of, let's say, Wall Street investors or something, and you try to tell them about how we need to care more about families. Maybe they like families. That's not really their job to care about families. Their job is to steward this and make money. If you come in and you have a sort of provocative claim about where the world is headed in 5 or 10 years based on really an understanding of political dynamics and understanding of other things, and your thesis has deep implications for how they would be allocating their portfolios, it's at least interesting. It's at least going to grab their attention. And if you make it persuasively, it may actually persuade them to move at a much larger scale than I think conservatives have traditionally been able to win in those domains. So that's how I approach things. And that's really the basis of New Founding. I believe that there's tremendous opportunities grounded in our understanding of the world and our understanding of where the world is moving. And I think you look at the last 5 years, in 10 years, it's very clear that the mainstream was absolutely shocked by many of the developments that took place, by the election of Trump, by in many cases Trump's return, by this major realignment of tech people. That wasn't shocking to me. That wasn't shocking to many people on the right. If we're right about those things, if we clearly understand things about the world that are largely missing in mainstream narratives and mainstream theories. So we need to be leveraging that to hilt. We need to be doubling down on those things, and we need to be using our advantage of understanding the world to design and envision and build and realize the institutions that we want, that will shape the world, that will shape this coming era in a way that is both better grounded in reality, which sets it up for more success, and is also more compatible with the order that we actually find desirable.
I like we said a moment ago, this idea of how you view reality and how often it feels like folks on, say our side, conservatives, Christians, we tend to very often to want to adopt or at least we're willing to adopt our opponent's view of reality, even in words like what is mainstream, right? You hear the mainstream. If the mainstream media was mainstream, they wouldn't be hemorrhaging viewers. Their newspapers wouldn't be shutting down. Their advertisers wouldn't be leaving. But yet we all kind of adopt, well, they're the mainstream, when in fact what we found is they're actually not the mainstream. And you see that repeated over and over, don't we?
Well, at the very least, even if they were the mainstream in some sense, even if they were the establishment, recognize the fragility. I think a key thing is also recognize that is not a static situation. That is a dynamic situation. They may be the establishment today, maybe not today. Maybe in early January they were, but they're not anymore. They are extremely vulnerable. And this is what I like about the Silicon Valley mindset too. The Silicon Valley mindset is very attuned to the ability to radically disrupt establishment institutions. And my argument, one of my principal arguments I've made to people on the right is we should be gravitating to sectors that are subject to disruption. If most institutions today are controlled by people who hold a hostile view of the world or hostile political values or just a different view of the world, sort of climbing in the establishment channels, you're just going to be sort of like you're swimming against the current most of the time. It's just sort of, it's hard. It's often unpleasant. You're often having to do it in institutions where the dominant values are values you don't like. You're surrounded by people who you often aren't going to like working with. If you instead appreciate the ways those institutions are going to be disrupted, certainly the way they can be disrupted, which is a very Silicon Valley mindset, at the very least, you can move over to a domain where the sort of deck is being reshuffled and you at least have a sort of 50-50. You at least have as good a shot as anyone else. There's none of that sort of current against you. And in many cases, you may actually have an advantage. You may actually have that disruption may be trending in a direction that we can really lever and use for our advantages. So a huge message, one of my top messages to people on the right is run toward disruption, embrace disruption. We've in many ways been a sort of dissident minority movement for a long time. Mm-hmm. Disruption's our friend when we're a dissident minority. If you're a dissident in the Soviet Union in the late 80s, disruptive ideas are your friend. Very much the case today, is sort of telling that the sort of so much of that disruptive world, that Silicon Valley world, has very quickly realigned to the right just over the last few years. I think that was a sort of something that I predicted would happen, and it's happened because ultimately the way the political alignment is shaking out is the Dems are increasingly the party of the sort of legacy managerial establishment, and the Republicans are the party of those who are challenging it.
So, I have to make a quick side here, Nate. I've all the different people I talked to over the years who kind of work in politics and business and kind of that intersection with culture. Generally, when people use the word disrupt or its variations, disruptive, disrupting, they do so with a very somber face, and they're, this might be disruptive to things. You get giddy when you use the phrase disruptive. And it feels like we're finding more and more folks like you who are understanding the value of disrupting a status quo that has really served to not only shackle our governing institutions, but shackle our investing institutions and essentially shackle people. Is that fair?
Well, absolutely. And I would say in many ways, one of the absolute centerpieces of this sort of legacy regime is the university system. You look at the university system and sort of those credentials increasingly determine everything, right? You get a Harvard Business School degree, and that's the most important credential in whether you'll be managing billions of dollars worth of capital. You get an expert degree in public health, and that gives you sort of power in that domain. So increasingly, they're the gatekeepers. And you look at the universities, and anyone on our side should be giddy about the idea of disruption of that space, because it's pretty clear that there's not a lot worth conserving and there's a lot worth disrupting. But I do think that the reason that people are somber, the reason people are nervous, I actually think it comes down, and this is a provocative idea, but I think it comes down to building our identity on conservatism. Mm-hmm. Conservatism, I think, is a great prudential instinct. If we change things too fast, we have to recognize there's good things that have existed and they exist for a reason. And so there should be institutions that are defending the good things of our tradition. Right. But if that becomes our entire identity, then disruption in technology is our enemy. And I think the problem is disruption and technology are going to continue whether we like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, if our identity is conservatism, if that's ultimately what we anchor everything around, then disruption and technology will be the enemy, and they will ensure that we gradually lose because they're going to continue if that's all you realize. Whereas if we realize, no, we actually have a vision for an order of the world. And coming as a Christian, I think as a Christian, I don't need to be shackled to a vision that's merely conservative. We have a vision given to us. In Genesis, it talks about taking dominion over the earth, filling the earth and subdue it. That's not a conservative vision. That's a vision of what we should aspire to as a movement. That's a positive vision that we can aspire to, that we can rally people toward building toward. And ultimately, we don't need to be constrained by disruption. So I think we as a movement need to put forth an appealing, positive vision. I would say who really moved the narrative in this direction is Donald Trump with MAGA. Make America Great Again is a positive vision of what to aspire to. It's not merely, let's say, William F. Buckley standing athwart history saying stop.
Right.
It's rallying people towards something. First off, that just works better. That gives us something that actually we get to be in the conversation about where we move to, as well as the conversation about what we should preserve. But second of all, it's just deeply American. Like America, certainly in Europe, I can see a sort of deep conservatism may have more appeal. It's a long tradition there. The American spirit loves aspiration. It loves chasing Texan. The Texan spirit loves chasing towards something big. Right. And ultimately, if we come up with a compelling vision, a compelling case for why our future is the future people should aspire to, that is going to resonate in America like nothing else. And so that ultimately, I think, is a winning move. It's a move that Trump has really initiated. There's now a huge amount up for grabs about what that actually looks like. And I think that is where I'm trying to play a significant role, is actually as Trump sort of directionally points us in that direction, he scales back so many of the federal restrictions and regulations and really prosecutions even that are trying to hamper us. We have a landscape opened up that allows us to really think 10, 20, 30 years down the future toward what should we aspire to have our country look like.
You know, I'm reminded as you're talking about and you think of the zealots of the, late, 10 BC up through, 70, 73 AD. They were zealous about disrupting the Roman Empire, but there's a lot of evidence that many of them didn't really know what they were disrupting towards. They just kind of got so caught up in the idea of opposing Rome that they didn't really have a sense of what they would do next. And there was a lot of infighting about what they would do next. How important do you think it is for us to maintain a vision on what we're disrupting to?
Absolutely imperative. And I think that is the question of our moment. It's a central question. To some extent, I defined new founding from the beginning. Yes, I said that we needed to aim toward a positive vision, right. But we were dissidents. It was a very strong part of our identity from the beginning. We were dissidents. We're not dissidents anymore. Trump's won. I think Trump has put the nail in the coffin of the legacy regime. I'm very optimistic that a lot of that is never going to return. I don't think in any way that means we've won. But what I think it means is the old regime is on the way out. There's going to be the fights that matter are going to be the fights everywhere we go. So I think that it's actually imperative that we move from a pure dissident framework to a positive one. I would say another problem with a lot of zealots is they're often very utopian. So it's very easy to focus on a utopian vision. I think there's a lot of groups that tend toward a sort of an unrealistic utopian. We need to be absolutely grounded in reality. And this is something that venture is great about. Everything is sort of a hypothesis that ultimately is tested by the reality of the market in many cases. Is this going to work? So a big part of what I've really spent a large part of the last 6 to 9 months at New Founding, but particularly with Trump's victory, it really increases the urgency, is thinking about what should we aspire to? How can we play a role in reframing ourselves from, let's call it dissident or even sort of right wing, to defining what does right wing mean? What does that look like? What are the values ultimately that we should, what are the sort of central theses about the world and values that we should center on and flesh out that positive vision?
It's very fascinating to me that, we have these established centers of business and of technology. I think, New York City, I think Silicon Valley. You've chosen to operate in Dallas. You've chosen Texas, which kind of leads to this idea of disruption, right?
Yes.
That, maybe Wall Street is reducing a little bit, maybe only by fractions in its import, and you're seeing centers of commerce and of entrepreneurship developing, not just in Dallas but in other parts of the country, red states, maybe, to use the kind of the CNN political vernacular. But is that a fair idea that we are seeing a devolution of not just knowledge in our political discourse, but also in our business discourse?
So I think it's happening to an extent, but it also sort of highlights the urgency of stepping up in certain degrees. So using the example of Wall Street losing influence, Wall Street is certainly stagnating. Wall Street is certainly moving jobs, for instance. There's, I don't know, 10,000 jobs will move to Dallas in the next decade from Wall Street. There's sort of two scenarios, I would say. One scenario is Dallas just doesn't really, one scenario is they just take those jobs and they really just become a back office of Wall Street.
Right.
In some sense, which means they maintain the same ethos, they maintain the same values. Ultimately, in many ways, the decision-making jobs in that scenario probably remain. They probably move the sort of secondary jobs. In many ways, it remains a financial colony of Wall Street. The alternative is that it steps up and embraces and recognizes this is moving for a reason. There's an opportunity for sort of a different ethos. Dallas and Texas really has an ethos that's a different ethos. Instead of just accepting these jobs, instead of sort of treating corporate relocations as, we're begging for them to bring jobs here because we want their sort of economic benefit they bring, realize we have something special. We have an ethos, we have a culture, we have a different way of doing finance. I would argue that Wall Street's stagnation is partially the product of sort of a bureaucratization of finance. Increasingly, it's moved from, the most dynamic hedge funds and whatever, the corporate raiders, to BlackRock, which is just it's sort of management by spreadsheet, basically. And either we can just do a lot of their spreadsheet jobs for them and do it in a lower cost of living place where it's sort of easier to find people, whatever, or we can realize there's an opportunity to offer a more human, more entrepreneurial. I think Texas is one of those places where people still sit down and have a lunch and it can lead to a $5 million investment or whatever. That itself is sort of an exceptional, that embodies the American culture. It very much embodies the Texas culture. And that's a very human way of doing finance. It's a sort of risk-taking. It's actually a risk-taking you see in Silicon Valley, absolutely. And it's one that I think absolutely the culture, temperament, capability, resources are here for this to be a hub of that, and realize that's actually better. We don't have to become more like Wall Street. We should actually double down on that and realize that as sort of the center of finance moves here, we shape those institutions according to that ethos and realize that there's a reason Texas has stayed more dynamic as New York has gotten more stagnant. And in that case, it looks a lot less like Dallas is the back office of New York and more like Dallas is a new center of sort of a post-ESG finance. Dallas could be the world hub, DFW broadly, and really Texas. I actually think Dallas is a natural hub sort of financially particularly, but Austin is a center of venture and a lot of new technology, especially this hard technology. Houston obviously is a center of energy, which is going to remain a huge component for a while. So Texas could be a real dynamic alternative that just charts its own course. In that scenario, you have way more decision makers here. This is not just the back office. This actually is a place where we have our own cast of decision makers. And I think at its best, it should be the place where, let's say you're a red state pension fund and you're looking to allocate money to managers. Well, one scenario is you sort of go to BlackRock and BlackRock allocates it for you. Another scenario is you realize that's not what I want. They don't align with our values. They don't align with our culture. They're stagnating in a way that's going to reduce alpha. We're just going to come to Texas and we're going to find managers based in Texas who are where the most dynamic sort of aspiring managers move. And we're just going to come here and we're going to look here first for allocating. And likewise, I think that sort of has a positive feedback where then the best managers come. And if you're a new manager trying to build your career, you could either sort of go to CalPERS in California and you got to check the DEI ESG boxes and it's ultimately hundreds of pages of forms and bureaucrats or whatever. And that's one way to build a firm. And if you have the right boxes that you check, you'll probably be very successful. The alternative is you just come here, you just want to make money. You just want to build something. You really want to sort of get down to business in a sense. Come here, don't even play that game. Don't even try to get money from those guys. Just set up shop here and this becomes the hub of where the allocators looking for that come. And then you sell these red state pension funds, you sell other people like that. And so I think that's those are sort of two different paths, and it's very easy. And there will be a lot of areas where there's a devolution of power or a stagnation of power. I think this applies at the level of Wall Street. I think it also applies at the level of a lot of federal power. And there will be probably states that just sort of coast on that. In many cases, they just sort of go along and they may experience meaningful declines actually. And sort of like post-Soviet Union, there were states that just sort of stagnated.
Right.
And then there were states that were freed up and sort of charted a course that was far different than they ever could have. And so I think it's imperative that leaders in these states recognize that this is not a sort of deterministic path. This is the opportunity of a lifetime to step up and lead as opportunity becomes centered at the state level. But opportunity is very different than sort of definite growth.
Yeah, so I think I guess that's maybe my question then is as we look at Texas, eighth largest economy, depending on how you count those things. If we were owned republic, we'd be the eighth largest economy. And there's a temptation when you're kind of at that level of success to let's just not upset the apple cart, right? And a lot of folks want to move here. You do want the the Wall Street back office. That's very attractive. That's safe. That's secure. What do we do as Texans? What do we encourage our policymakers to be doing? What do businessmen do to make sure that in the ongoing rush to bring in more business, bring in jobs, bring in back offices, how do we not see that Texas ethos get, consumed by the things that led to the problems elsewhere? How do we protect that ethos in Texas?
Well, I'll make one point, which is even more, we want the front offices, not just the back offices.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If you're merely low cost labor, you're great for the back offices. If you have a distinct culture, you'll be where you might actually attract the managers, you'll attract the exec, you'll attract the guy running the hedge fund who's starting in New York and realize he doesn't really like that and he moves here, or the venture capitalist. I think here in Austin, Joe Lonsdale, he didn't just move his back office here, he moved here. Elon Musk is moving his companies here. So I think our aspiration means we actually need to think about what does it take to be the sort of place that leaders want to be. And part of that is how do we define a culture that's distinct? So I actually think one of the things is there's often a fear when you're trying to attract back offices. In many cases, your biggest fear is sort of offending the culture of the company that's moving. A great example would be Mike Pence. As he got pushback he passed in, I think, 2014 or 2015, this Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana. He immediately got pushback from Eli Lilly, which was already there, and Salesforce and all these others, and very quickly reversed and scaled back because he didn't want to do anything that would offend these companies. Just a deep fear of offending the sort of corporations that you depend on for their largesse. And that's absolutely the wrong approach. The alternative approach is you actually realize we have our culture, and our culture is good. And our culture is why the state is the way it is. So we're going to double down on that. If we double down on things like our culture, Texas, guns, right? People, I like to tell people people are walking around with guns all the time at Texas. If you don't like that, don't go here. And there's a lot of people who like that. The right people like that. The wrong people don't like that. So don't try to tone down the thing that's going to scare away people. Emphasize it. I think this applies to a lot of bills on the sort of cultural right? Like bathroom bills, trans-related stuff, abortion. It's like, don't be afraid of those. Recognize that those end up serving as filters that filter out people who are going to be a problem, are going to conflict with that, but they're going to make the state more attractive to people who share our ethos. And then I think secondly, and I think this is sort of that's good on a filter standpoint, but also have a vision, develop a strong vision. And this is sort of a call I make to really the statesmen of our day. A statesman think in terms of vision. It's very often to see sort of state level politics, state level institutions is really just a stepping stone to quickly get to the federal level or the State Department or something where the real statesmanship is happening.
Right. The real statesmanship.
Yeah. And that's it's been and to some extent that's been true during an era when the world has become more globalized and more centralized and more is happening in DC. But that's not the story of this era. The story of this era is actually a devolution of power. So if you're someone who wants to shape vision, wants to be a statesman, I actually think you should be thinking about states, thinking about how your state can actually have a distinct vision that is going to step up in this era and take advantage of it and really inspire people. Like, what is the vision for Texas? What is a vision for Texas that makes it a desirable place for those types of people to come, for those types of young people to come. And I think that, California is it's an instructive example. California, very large economy, sort of coasted, and it coasted in a very dangerous direction where it's really falling apart in so many ways. Now they have an incredible sort of geographic endowment, so it gives them the luxury of getting away with that. Their incredible climate and such. Well, Texas has some incredible geographic endowment as well, with our energy and really a central spot in the country. But what we need is a vision. What drew people so much to Silicon Valley, so much of that was often a sort of narrative and vision about how this could be the tip of the spear changing the world in valuable ways. Well, I think that there's a lot of ways that Texas could have a narrative and vision that has Texas leading a lot of, and it doesn't even need to be in a globalized sense, like we're leading the world in a global sense, but it could be we're leading the world as an example of what a society could look like. And even if we're not trying to rule directly create the institutions that rule over everyone in the country, we create the institutions we create a culture that's a business culture people admire and aspire to. We create a sort of model of how a state can thrive, and a model of sort of politics and government that is an example that people are following. You actually saw a lot of this with DeSantis in Florida, where DeSantis was sort of stepping out and leading. I think there were a lot of governors who were sort of turning their head and looking at him and noticing the attention he was getting. And if we had state governors with that mindset across the board, that's the opportunity. You turn heads around the nation to just look at you and sort of look to imitate. That becomes a huge part of it. So I think part of it is just that domain, that level of ambition that people have.
So as we see success building, as we see those, kind of Texas moving from the 10th to the 8th large economy, all those kind of things happening, entrepreneurs building up strong businesses, unique kind of businesses in Texas. Lethargy really is the enemy. I'm kind of reminded of kind of the John O'Sullivan. I'm going to kind of bastardize his quote here, but essentially it's those things which are not explicitly right will become anti-right. Those things which are not explicitly Christian will become anti-Christian. You really can't afford to coast, can you?
Absolutely not. And I think that's an interesting one. That's absolutely a dynamic sort of when the pervasive dominant ethos is controlled by the left. I think that's why that sort of O'Sullivan's law happens. I would say here, I'm not even sure if it becomes left in the same way, because I kind of think the left is in shambles, but it just means that other people will determine our destiny.
Right.
And they may be left, they may be transhumanist, they may be any number of things, but ultimately when things are up for grabs, you're either going to double down and sort of determine. I mean, the motto that has really resonated for New Founding is build the America you want to live in. Are you building what you want to live in, or is someone else going to do that?
I want to take you back for a second. When you were coming out of law school, 24, 25, 26 years old, what advice do you wish that someone had given you then? What advice do you give to, people coming out of high school, coming out of college, who want to follow a different kind of path in business than is kind of what's typically taught in our fine institutions?
So the biggest one, and it's interesting because it was sort of I did this, so I didn't need to. So it sort of my advice, in some sense, the advice that would have helped me would have been slightly different. But I think that the strongest one is, don't follow that path of inertia, especially with these institutions, with these colleges. The path of inertia is getting worse and worse. When I graduated, supposedly it was an 8-year track to become a partner at a law firm. Well, I have friends who are up for partner this year. This is 15 years later or something. They sort of, certainly it very clearly extended to 10, 11, 12 years. And I think that's just getting worse and worse. Business schools, the sort of crop of people coming from elite business schools. I've talked to venture capitalists about this and others. Without question, widely recommended is just a cut below where they were 10 years ago. So I think we see this world where the conventional sort of elite paths are just getting progressively less attractive. And I think you see this when a sort of space is shrinking, which I think you're seeing with many of these spaces. Those who have it tend to just hold on to it longer and they share less and they try to hold on to a share of a shrinking pie. And that's a horrible place to build your career. You can use those institutions. It might not be bad for you to use a stint at McKinsey, for instance, for a few years. It can be incredible training. But if you put your hopes in McKinsey, if that's really where you're directing your ambitions, you're going to be disappointed, almost certainly. So really understand that the world is in flux, and that is a world that rewards people who step out the box. Now, you need to do that in a calculated way. Sort of going to my own sort of advice, I actually think we would have done well to be more actively in touch with sort of elite circles, not necessarily be legacy elite circles, but recognize that there's groups of people, there's nodes that are attracting sort of very capable, ambitious people. I think at that era, a great example would be the Bitcoin world, right? It was very, very early in Bitcoin. That might have been too early for any except sort of a really sort of focused person to see it. But there's sort of nodes like that, and spending time sort of gravitating toward where sort of the best, smartest, and often sort of most independent-minded people are going is attractive. There's a value to those networks. There's a value to those connections. There's even a value to spending a few years at McKinsey, as I said. But don't gravitate. Don't let yourself be driven by the inertia. So recognize that there's a lot more reward for sort of your human agency. Your agency is valuable, and you should be willing to step out, even as you sort of use access to whether it be sort of legacy or new circles as a tool to sort of give yourself the ability to help chart the course you want.
Nate Fischer, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. And thank you for joining us for this conversation with a real Texan.